Thank you very much for the invite to be here today. I got the envious task of bringing everyone back after lunch, and probably one subject that no one really wants to talk about in the room. So a little bit of background about myself. I grew up halfway between Mulmerran and Gundy on a mixed grazing and cropping property. Had the joy of leaving when I was 12 to go to boarding school. And as you'll see through my presentation today, Tom and I might have had the same senior English teachers because we probably have the same spelling mistakes. After that I went and did a bit of a uni stint, and it's funny how agriculture, I often say that we've lost the culture out of agriculture. Basically I was a glorified PE teacher who could teach physics, chemistry and biology when I left uni, and Education Queensland, because I grew up on a property to the age of 12, thought I was qualified to run the Ag Science Department. During that time I did a couple of things, including setting up my own private business in the NLIS establishment days, and I had a student whose parents suicided and she turned to me for support. At that stage I realised after 5 years of university and 2 degrees that I had absolutely no bloody idea about mental health. That's now 10 years ago, and I've been bouncing around in this field for the last 10 years. The organisation that I work for, Rural and Remote Mental Health, is a not-for-profit charity. We don't receive any government funding other than that we're lucky enough to get from grants or philanthropic organisations, or currently I'll talk to you about some of the training that we're offering for rural and remote communities funded under the Movember program and the NAB Foundation. So today I hope that what we'll do is we'll go through, I've got a few videos that we actually use in that community training. This is a 101 on mental illness because we don't know what we don't know. I will be talking about suicide a little bit today and some Australian statistics. I hope that that is taken in the manner in which it is delivered, and if anyone's distressed about that, please feel free to come and see me afterwards, because one of the other things that I do is I do go around and do a 2-day training course on how to intervene with people that are suicidal. It's a hard topic, but we've got to talk about it because there's too many people in the bush that are losing their lives, and there's not enough of us around to do that. So hopefully I'll increase your awareness and understanding around what is mental illness and the mental health issues, provide some strategies and increase confidence. We've got to be confident in talking about mental health and suicide in the bush because it's such an issue, and how we can help our friends and families. A lot of people have spoken already about coming together as a community. That's one of the strongest benefits we can have, is how to support ourselves and help our mates and our families. And then obviously I'll direct you to some pathways for help, because it's pointless raising this issue and then not telling you where you can go for some assistance, because there is assistance out there and it does work. The critical thing is the sooner you get help, the better the outcomes.
Mental ill health comes in all shapes and sizes. Very often it sneaks up on you. Sometimes it hits you out of the blue, but there are symptoms and warning signs along the road to watch out for, in yourself, your family and your friends. Mood swings that are out of the ordinary. Our moods change all the time, that's normal, but if the mood swing's really uncharacteristic, that's a heads up. Loss of interest in doing the things you usually enjoy. A lack of self-esteem, feeling worthless. A lack of motivation, you just can't seem to get going. Unusual tiredness or a change in sleeping patterns. A change in appetite, including weight gain and weight loss. Withdrawal, lack of interest in engaging socially. Hitting the booze and the smokes more than usual. Tension and physical pain. Lack of sex drive, you're really just not interested. Poor immune system, you seem to be catching every cold and virus that comes around. Also unusual skin conditions, rashes, cold sores and psoriasis. You just can't seem to focus, you're forgetful, you find it hard to concentrate, hard to make decisions. Increased or unusual absenteeism from work. Presenteeism, when you show up for work, but you're so unproductive, you might as well not have bothered. The thing is, we all suffer from these things from time to time. So how do we know if there's a mental health problem over the horizon? Easy. If you have 4 or more of these symptoms for more than 2 or 3 weeks on the trot, chances are there's a mental health problem coming down the line. Time to do something about it. Prevention is better than a cure, and the faster you get onto it, the quicker the recovery. You really don't want to let it turn into a mental illness.
All right, so the next couple of videos in the same series. For interest, the bloke who presented that for us was Keith Rashid. He was instrumental in ecotourism in South Australia, and he's a bit of an icon down there, drives around in a bright pink Land Cruiser ute. So a little bit of trivia for you. The next two videos I run back to back, and then that'll be the end of the videos today. I did drop that in to try and wake people up a little bit. Speaking specifically about risk factors and then recognising the signs and symptoms, not just in yourself, but in those that you're around working and also living with.
Mental ill health costs lives and money. It can and does destroy individuals, families, and even communities. 1 in 5 Australians will have a mental health problem in any 1 year. Out here, this ratio rises to between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4. Of Australia's 23 million people, over 15 million people live in capital cities, towns or other major metropolitan centres. The remaining 8 million people are spread out across 8 million square kilometres of rural and remote Australia. There are about 140,000 farm businesses in Australia, and over 90% of farms are run by families. In the 1950s, there were as many as 250,000 farming families. A few years ago, they calculated there were over 310,000 people working in Australian agriculture. When you add in all the indirect jobs, the agricultural sector was then responsible for over 1.6 million jobs in the Australian economy. The total value of Australian agricultural production was $46 billion. Mental ill health costs Australia about $20 billion per year in lost productivity. About $6.6 billion of this loss comes from the rural sector. As I said, mental ill health costs lives and money. A lot of both, especially out here.
There are so many other risk factors and pressures that people face in their everyday lives. But when we're experiencing these risk factors, it's very important, because mental illness is an individual thing. What affects one person in one way and increases their stress level to a point where they just cannot cope any further and they become clinically depressed, another person would take that in their stride and it wouldn't affect them at all. And that's the difficulty that we face, especially around evaluation of programs around mental health for government funding and things, is it's very difficult to say, well, we prevented 20 suicides in Chinchilla, or we were up out of Birdsville and we ran a program and trained 50 people, but what was the result of that? How many people didn't get depression or anxiety, didn't develop schizophrenia? It's very, very difficult. In rural communities, that's where we focus on making sure it's a community response to this so that we're looking after each other. So how to recognise some of the risk factors?
It can be hard out here. There are lots of risk factors to our mental health, particularly for the men. Let's have a look at some of them. Men who live out here take greater risks. Per head of population, they drink more, smoke more, and die more often in work and motor vehicle accidents than the people who live in the towns and the cities. They also have a higher rate of heart and lung disease. It's a horrible statistic, but rural men are suiciding at a rate of about 2 a day. And some people think that's a significant underestimation. Mental ill health is pretty common out here, but blokes tend not to talk about it. There's the stigma, of course, and the Australian male thing of just sucking it up. They're blokes, and they don't want to admit weakness or ask for help. It's that stigma thing again. Stigma and male pride. We find it very hard to maintain our livelihood in the face of drought and changing climate conditions. There's not a lot else we can do. Not a lot of employment options out here if the farm isn't working. Men and women, we can all feel trapped. Nowhere else to go, nothing else to do. Then there's the ongoing financial crisis. Each year we're a little further behind than the year before. And there's stress of the thought that we might lose our land. And if we don't lose our land, There's the succession question. The kids go to school in the city and quite often they don't want to come back. Honestly, can you blame them? Then there's the isolation. Sometimes it's what we want, but it's not what we need. These are the risks and the stresses that those of us who live in the bush face. Risks and stresses are a normal part of life, but if they don't let up, if you don't get a break, then these stresses can turn into mental health problems. Depression and anxiety, certainly, but there are others.
And that's the key message. Prevention is far better than the cure, especially with mental illness. So from that basically extensive list of anything that could go wrong with you, there's a couple of critical things you can take out of it. Mental illness and suicidality does not discriminate. It does not matter whether you come from a farming institution, you're unemployed in Redfern in Sydney, you're a ringer from the Territory, or an islander living on Palm Island. It does not matter. It does not discriminate. Some of these groups have higher incidences of suicidality and mental illness, but it does not discriminate. Similarly with your behaviour and looking out for risks, it doesn't delineate just because all of a sudden you're sleeping more that you're definitely depressed. It doesn't mean that because you have skin afflictions that you've got anxiety. It's a symptom that can be a part of that mental health disorder. And events, trigger points. Again, as I said, it's an individual thing. So some people will take in their stride what other people, it absolutely floors them. And that's why we need to look at prevention rather than cure, because until we cross that bridge ourselves, we don't know. We can't judge. So the most critical thing to remember with mental health is that it can be anybody. Doesn't matter the colour of the skin, the balance in your bank account, anybody can be struck down by mental illness. Same as suicidality in the community. So, in order to prevent suicide and mental illness, we need a community response. That makes sense. The next two slides are going to be very confronting. They are specifically about suicide in Australia in 2015. This first one is. The second one is talking about the suicide trend in Australia and why we have to do something about this. So we've got a population of 24 million. Reported suicides were over 3,000 people in that year. Now, this is the most up-to-date data from the ABS. They normally take about 2 years to get the data out. So when we're talking about suicide prevention programs, and there's a significant amount of money released federally or announced federally recently for this, $140 million, how do you actually evaluate that that money's going to good use when your data is 2 years behind? On the bus trip yesterday, I think it was you, Tom, said garbage in, garbage out. That's the way data works. Unfortunately, in order for a death to be confirmed as a suicide, there has to be a really stringent list of tick boxes, basically, before the coroner can confirm that. So we got 3,086 suicides. Unreported suicides in the statistics, we believe, can be up to 25% higher than that. Suicidal behaviours, which are attempts, are 40 to 100 times higher than the reported suicides. The number of people affected by each suicidal behaviour is obviously variant on how widely that person affects other people. So if you look at someone like Robin Williams, where everybody knew of him, had watched one of his movies, his suicide had a far greater ripple effect. In any 1 year, it's believed that 1 in 20 people will have thoughts of suicide in Australia. So if we've got 80 people in the room, this is a pretty tight-knit community, all under the banner of PRA. It's a pretty scary thought that there could be 4 people at any time in any 12 months in this room who are thinking about taking their own life. And what do we know? How do we know who they are? And how do we care for them? This is probably the one that I really get on my soapbox about. External causes of death in Australia, and this is trend lining up to 2012 for the decade, and this has only increased. If you take the number of people killed on our roads and those killed by homicides, they still do not equate to the number of people we've lost through suicide in Australia in the last 10 years, and this trend actually goes for the last 15 years. And you think about the amount of money spent on road tolls. Suicides are not all preventable, but the vast majority of suicides are a preventable death by the community knowing how to respond and being connected. There is no if, buts or maybes around that. So when we talk about prevention and a community response, we've really got to be smart about how we put that funding to effort. So as an individual, the person, your hardest judge, who looks back at you every morning when you wash your face in the mirror, you will be your hardest judge. And what can you personally do about it for yourself? Ironically, there's a lot of things you can do. The most critical one is be honest and fair with yourself. You know how you're travelling. We can all put the masks on for the wife, the husband, the kids, the parents, the bank manager. You're the person who looks back at yourself every morning in that mirror. You know how you're travelling. You've got to be honest with yourself. If you're struggling, what can you do? And I'll get to that soon. It is impossible to make good decisions without a clear head. So it's ironic that when you're in a high stress situation and you're expected to make life-changing decisions, that's when you have your greatest difficulty in making decisions. That's why prevention is so critical. To keep yourself grounded, know what's going on with you before you go into those difficult situations. So the other things you can do is exercise. And people say, oh, well, I spent 4 hours on a horse and 6 hours in the yards today just drafting cattle. That was exercise. Yes, you were physically active, but you were thinking about what was going on. One of the biggest benefits of exercise is that you actually can clear your head and not thinking about your business, not thinking about the debt, link energy, the legalities, succession planning. It's time for you to do something for yourself. Exercise could be going for a walk down to the front gate to get the mail on back. Depending on how far your front gate is, it could be a lot of exercise. But again, it's a personal thing. It's working out what works for you. Sleep. And again, this is an individual thing. Some people can function on 5 hours of sleep. Other people, they need their 9 hours of sleep a day. But good sleep hygiene is when your body actually recuperates. So physically and mentally, make sure you're getting the rest you need. Diet. Same as data. You put shit in, you get shit out. No processed foods. As much fresh fruit and vegetable as you can. It's very, very common sense, this, and I don't want to be seen to be teaching you to suck eggs, but this is the simple way that you can help yourself to prevent mental illness and stay strong so you can make those good decisions. Limit the grog and smoke and drugs. One of the biggest issues that we see in rural and regional areas across Australia is illicit drugs and the ice problem. It's massive. I've got one particular person that I'm working with in a recovery situation who comes from a town, let's say within 5 hours of here, without putting too fine a point on it. He dealt in that town for 2 years, and he reckons he sold to 80% of the town at one stage or another. From 8 and 9-year-old kids in primary school up to 90-year-old people in the retirement village. And the cops verify it. The cops knew about it. They could never catch him, but they knew he was dealing, and they knew that was the breadth. And that's how bad it is in some of our rural and regional communities. And they don't help you make the decisions, they only mask the pain. This is the big one. Take time out for yourself. I was speaking this morning about holidays. Holiday can be as much as just going into town to do the shopping and staying a night in the hotel. It's getting you a break, getting off the place. Allowing yourself that time to recover and relax. You need a break. Because if you're continually going over things, you get fatigued. Then you get physically sick. Then you start questioning yourself. And it's a snowball. So it's an investment in yourself. And this one's always a difficult one. Be prepared to say no. The local rugby club needs you to come in and run the bar. Well, sorry, no. I've got to take some time out for myself. It'd be great to have that socialisation, but I've got to be my first priority. because I'm in a fight for my life, literally. So you've got to be selfish. You've got to be able to say, no, sorry, I'm not going to drive to Adelaide for Christmas this year. One, because I probably can't bloody afford it. But two, no. If you want to see us at Christmas, you come to us for once. Oh, but we've always gone to Adelaide. Well, not this year. Be prepared. You've got to prioritise yourself. As a community or a group, PRA, what can we do about it? You don't know what you don't know. So again, thank you for the invite to present here today. I hope there's something useful that comes out of it. But we are all in this together. And very similar like the Marlborough group. They came together for a common cause. They worked together collaboratively, actually met other people in their community that they knew of but had never met before. They had that bond. They looked after each other. Humans are a mob animal, baseline. If you look at a mob of cattle and there's one beast off on its own, what do you think? Something wrong with it? It's ill, sick, might be calving. You don't know, but there's something abnormal about that. Humans are the same. We need to come together. I can remember growing up, and it's certainly not as long ago as some other people have got experience in the room, but there were monthly tennis comps where we went and had a barbecue, played tennis. So we had physical exercise, we had diet, probably a few too many beers, but that's when the kids learnt to drive home. Like, we came together as a group. The blokes all stood around the barbecue and bitched and whinged about politicians and the weather and the current prices. The ladies were all preparing the food. But we talked, we communicated, we came together as a group. And guess what? Next month it's your turn. It was something to look forward to. That's mental health. 5 minutes, thank you. All right, so we've got to look after each other. We have that responsibility to look after ourselves first and then others, especially when we're fighting for the common goal. There are plenty of prominent people from all walks of life who continue to function successfully in community with mental illness. It's not a death sentence. There is help available and it does work. Take the classic example of Greg Inglis. How on earth could you think that someone in his status, with what he's got lying at his feet as far as a professional sportsman and the massive money that he's on, how could he become depressed? He's got sports psychologists and doctors and every other physiologist you can think of literally at his fingertips. Yet he still gets depressed. The critical thing is to have a yarn. Rural people talk. We do. We don't talk about the things we need to, and that's got to change. So, I mentioned earlier about clinical help. There are plenty of pathways to clinical help. If you've done everything you can with your diet, your sleep, your exercise, stayed off the grog, and you still develop a mental illness, or someone you love or care for or are an associate with develops a mental illness, there are pathways to help, even out in rural and regional areas. I've got 2 staff based here in Chinchilla who deal with severe and persistent mental illness through the Partners in Recovery program. They get clinical assistance to their 60-odd people that they work with here in Chinchilla and the Western Downs. There is clinical assistance available. You've got to know where to look. That's the problem. And the sooner that you seek help, the better the outcomes. So if we can't prevent it, we've got to get help quickly, and we've got to get appropriate help quickly. There are telephone and websites, and the new MBS numbers with telepsychiatry will help. I've been involved in some trials with the RFDS where face-to-face interviews were done initially, and then it became a telehealth, a telepsychiatry. It was effective. They actually had a higher rate of adherence to treatment than the current ATAPs at that time, which is the Applied Psychology Services. GP is the front line. If you're feeling shit, get to your GP. Remember that person who looks back at you in the mirror every morning? If they're being honest and fair with you and saying, no, mate, you're struggling at the moment, get to your GP. When you make that appointment, make sure that you ask for a double appointment because it's referring to mental health. 2 reasons for that. One, it'll take a double appointment for you to get through, to get the process started. Secondly, that'll come up when the GP actually sees you walk in the room. So you might walk in there and you'll say, oh, I've got a bung toe and a scuffed knee and a sore shoulder and this ear hurts. But he knows you're there for mental health, so you can't chicken out of it. So when you're being honest with yourself and you make that double appointment, say it's for mental health, and the GP will then follow up. There are social workers, psychologists and psychiatrists that are the clinical level. And as I said, they do exist in rural and regional areas. They're not easy to find, but they do exist. And we certainly can get them and they help. Then there is your acute mental health wards. So in this case, in Chinchilla and surrounds, it's through to Toowoomba. The other thing about all of this, remember it's an individual thing. If you come across a GP or you're going down the clinical way and a social worker, a psych or a psychiatrist, and you don't click, you're talking about some pretty personal, pretty serious stuff. If it doesn't click, be prepared to say so. And I'm sorry, you're not the right fit for me. Go back, get another referral and go to someone else. Now that's very tokenistic to say. When you're down and out, lacking motivation, really struggling to get out of bed, and I'm saying, yeah, we'll go through the whole process again. But that's how serious this is. You need to be honest and fair with yourself in order to do it. That's why. That's why you have to do it. You are your best asset. You are the only one in your corner, and that's why you owe it to yourself to be selfish and look after your mental health and suicide prevention. Because it's that critical. Now, I know that I'm out of time, but in your little bag, you've got a couple of things. The first one is an Awesome Day CD. Please do not play that on the way home because you'll probably fall asleep. We don't want a motor vehicle accident. This is a song that I commissioned with a mate of mine, John Schumann. John was the singer-songwriter for Red Gum and wrote the song I was only 19. John wrote this song based on a family's perception of drought. So have a listen to the dulcet tones, and as I said, if you suffer from insomnia, it'll be really good for that. The other thing is this little document, the Passport to Mental Health and Agriculture. Remember, this is about prevention and early intervention. This one was written by John and myself, specifically for people in rural and regional areas, around some of the things that you may find stressful in your everyday working and personal life, living in isolation in rural and regional Australia as primary producers. Have a look through it. I encourage all of you to keep it on the bookshelf. It may be useful for you now, it may be useful for you next week, it may be useful for your neighbour at some stage or your best friend, loved one, whomever. Keep it around. At the back of it, there are a list of phone lines that you can contact and websites. So if the stigma is there and you can't face your GP, there is help available. Okay, so please make sure, especially tonight, when you brush your teeth and you look at yourself in that mirror, remember, you owe it to yourself because you are your best asset.